your work was very interesting to me because it made me think, especially like your overall message on wholeness, and in particular, like I thought when you're talking about bigotry, um, preventing like all these relationships from developing, and it kind of resonated with me because I was like, how many of my relationships are prevented by people not showing the same interests, and then I kind of took it as in the bigger picture, as a society, we're all trying to niche down on stuff when there's a lot that's the whole person. There's not many whole people like about. Like, well, what does a whole person even look like? That's like well-rounded, and that's not fixated by their interests. So, I first wanted to ask you, what was your passion um, towards this message becoming so important to you? If that makes sense.
I think so. Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up in a religious home that was equal parts curious, equal parts dogmatic, and specifically the type of God, let's say, that I grew up believing in. It was a Christian home, but the type of God that I grew up believing in was a God that was super surveillancy, that was constantly trying to check and make sure I was good or good enough. And as a result, I internalized some insecurities around just the very nature of my existence. Trying to constantly prove I was worthy was a feature, I would say, not a bug, of the religious paradigm I grew up in. And I would say that when your nervous system is conditioned in such a way as to believe that you're supposed to be on the defensive all the time, you don't actually notice that that's the position where you're coming from. So like David Foster Wallace in his commencement speech has this story where he says there's two fish swimming in water, and one fish comes along and says, "How's the water?" And another fish asks, "What's water?" It's like if your entire nervous system has been conditioned to be defensive, which is to say, conditioned to constantly ask the question, am I good enough? Am I worthy enough? So on and so forth, then you won't actually realize that that's what you're doing. However, in senior year in college, I had an anthropology professor who showed up in a way that defied the paradigms I thought ruled the world or ruled my world. She showed up as a agnostic, liberal professor who I expected would be just labeled as other. Like I've expected that I could label her as other and see her as other because she didn't necessarily believe in God and she wasn't conservative. And I also grew up in a conservative home. So I labeled her as other, and then one day, several days, but one day in particular, she showed up in such a way that actually demonstrated a kind of Christian love, or what has been described as Christian love, sort of unconditional love for people that she didn't necessarily agree with. She showed us a documentary called Jesus Camp, which portrays very religious Christians sending their kids to a camp to learn how to speak in tongues. And I expected her to portray or talk about these people in a very dehumanizing way, but in fact, she defended them when she was, when another student who was atheist in the class dehumanized them. And that simple moment, actually, I've come to describe that as a kind of ego trip. It was very, very hard for me because it challenged my assumptions about the way the world works. And I actually experienced incredible amounts of depression and anxiety as a result of that experience, which I have subsequently worked through. And I think that the development of the theory of enchantment, this sort of paradigm that you're describing now, which basically tries to teach people how to become whole, came out at least in part as a response to that transformation that I experienced, moving from adolescence at home to this kind of like transition liminal state where I was still at home, but I was in college. So I'm learning new ideas that aren't stemming from my parents or the church that I grew up in, and then culminating in my move to New York, which is where I currently reside.
So is wholeness like the absence of restraint on what you're willing to like believe or experience? Like, can you sort of give me some kind of definition or elaborate on what that term means to you?
I can certainly try. I don't think wholeness is the absence of necessarily restraining, or I don't think wholeness is the absence of restraining what you believe. I think that wholeness is a state of integration where you are in a conscious relationship with the full spectrum of your emotions as they arise. So, integration is related to the word integrity, and that's not a coincidence. The ability to be integrated means communing with your shadow. So Carl Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. What does that mean on a practical level? It means that I engage in a regular practice of noticing when I'm feeling emotional pain, let's say insecurity, and voicing that or journaling about that. It means that I notice when I'm feeling superior to another human being, meaning my ego has created a sense of separation between myself and another person that I've started to look down on. Not only noticing that, but then writing about that, speaking about that, bringing it to consciousness. Because once we bring it to consciousness, it becomes destigmatized and thus has less control over us. Not only that, but also being aware of when one feels or when I feel expansive, when I feel connected, when I feel joyful, writing about that, bringing conscious attention to it. It is not merely an intellectual thought process. It is also a somatic experience. I feel very different when I am feeling defensive versus when I'm feeling expansive. So just entering into a regular habit and a practice where I'm bringing conscious attention to it, and ideally doing that in community with other people who are also doing that, is what creates over time an integrated community, an integrated society. So it's a dynamic thing. It's not a static, fixed thing. The act of achieving balance, which is, I think, synonymous to the act of achieving wholeness, presupposes a kind of constant movement. There's no fixed place at which you're to arrive. Many Eastern metaphysical systems speak about this. So, for example, there was a famous Korean monk whose name I can't pronounce, who wrote a book called Only Don't Know. In Eastern metaphysics, there's the presentation of a paradigm that's very distinct from, let's say, the more Western metaphysics of Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, right? In the East, there are very different paradigms that say, essentially, don't think. Your thoughts do not determine who you are. Your thoughts come and go constantly, like the waves in an ocean. And mindfulness meditation is all about entering into the habit where you're able to see that. So I say all that to say that in the state of wholeness is not about arriving at some concrete end or, final state, but rather about constantly being in a dynamic relationship with what is arising within you and what is arising between you and another person.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I really like that, actually, the idea of integrating every aspect of your being, every aspect of yourself. So am I right in saying, tell me if I'm wrong, that exposure you had to a teacher, wasn't it, you said, showed you or like highlighted to you that part of your own shadow, this adolescent girl who was always in this defensive state because of the narratives she was told? That part of your shadow was highlighted, that part of your being was sort of exposed to you, and then you can recognize that and learn to work with that. Is that sort of, am I on the right lines there? Yeah.
Yes, but I should, again, I just want to emphasize that it is a difficult path. So I think it is necessary for really the wholeness of the whole world for people to go through this experience. But it's a very difficult experience. It's a very painful experience. And so people should be aware of that, which is why it's important to stress doing it in community or seeking out community of people who are interested in making that transition, because doing it alone is very, very difficult. It is kind of, if you're familiar with psychedelics or psychedelic journeys, it is what I would describe as a non-drug induced ego dissolution.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think you're right. I think I've had similar experiences. Like, to me, what you're saying relates to thoughts I've had about a kind of revelation of deeper self-awareness that I had. I was kind of just struck with, like, it seemed to come out of nowhere when in my sort of mid-teens, that I wasn't expecting, and it was difficult. And what helped me come out of that was finding people who were on a similar path and sort of understood what I was getting at and what was going on. But I want to ask, to sort of put this into context and, I don't know, give people a bit more insight of why we're talking about this kind of thing. Why is it important to be integrated? Like, what's the danger of that? Why can't we just only focus on certain parts of ourselves?
Well, the danger of not being integrated is what has been described in psychology as splitting, or having a split mindset. So, for example, the word schizophrenia means split mind. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s described the United States of America as a deeply schizophrenic society because of its pro and racism. And you might be wondering, well, what is the connection between not being whole, not being integrated, and bigotry, which is, of course, what Theory of Enchantment, my organization, focuses primarily on solving for. What happens when we are not integrated is we experience some sort of psychological pain, let's say insecurity, and all human beings experience insecurity. This is natural and a part of the human condition. But if we don't know how to deal with that insecurity in a healthy, holistic way, again, if we don't know how to bring conscious attention to the feelings of insecurity as they arise and fall within us, we will more than likely default to unconsciously splitting. So what that means is we will see the world in black and white. So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine a young man who was born into an alcoholic family, whose parents did not have the wherewithal to give him everything he needed, neither materially nor psychologically. And as a result of this experience of insecurity, he felt deeply worthless. And he had nowhere to put those feelings. He had nowhere to discharge those feelings. And along comes an organization that essentially tells him, I'm going to make you feel worthy. I'm going to make you feel loved. I'm going to make you feel like you have a sense of purpose. All you have to do is adopt this ideology that says that because you have white skin color, you are better than everyone else. This group is a white nationalist organization. And so as a response to pain and as a response to deep insecurity, this young man takes up this ideology, becomes a part of this group, because he is desperately seeking belonging. And in this case, the adoption of this group and the adoption of this ideology, which is a split viewed or orientation or ideology, meaning the ideology sees the world in black and white. The ideology simply says all the people who look like me are good and all the people who don't look like me are bad, right? There are plenty of people in this organization, by the way, that fell into it the same way this young man fell into it. So it's worth mentioning that as well. But because this young man doesn't know how to cope with his pain in a healthy way, he reaches for a salve, which is essentially akin to an addiction. In this case, hatred that is being championed by an organization. We have traditionally, in many ways, understood hatred as a kind of mystical thing that we can't do anything about, that is utterly impossible to understand. But James Baldwin famously said that the reason people cling to their bigotries and their hatreds is because they don't know how to deal with pain. He actually understood hatred to be very similar to opioid addiction or alcohol addiction or any other hard drug addiction that people reach for to cope with pain. So it's important to learn how to become integrated and whole, because the practices that enable us to do so actually stop us from devolving into relationships with others who are different from us that can be characterized by hatred and bigotry. There's a reason why in the United States of America, the word integration has a great deal of cultural weight, right? We had a very long integration process in the 60s and 70s. Many of the civil rights pieces of legislation that were passed in 1964, for example, were meant to bring about this thing called integration in the United States of America. We usually understand this as simply Black kids and white kids going to school together Black people and white people, going to places of worship, libraries, etc. together. No more separate institutions, facilities, etc. based on race. But I would say the United States of America never did the psychosocial spiritual work to actually achieve integration on the deeper level that we're talking about right now. And it is precisely that work that actually can sustain the more, I would say, superficial work of simply saying you can go wherever you want, regardless of skin color. Obviously, that was a necessary first step, but the work has not been completed. And I think a lot of the culture wars that we're seeing in the United States today are a result of the absence of that work being completed.
Yeah, it's just such a nice thing as well to have like such a range of personalities and ideologies around you, because otherwise I think if you wanted to change, it's a lot harder when the group maybe thinks in quite a common way. But I wanted to ask, if someone's listening to this right now and they want to maybe become more whole, is there any actionable steps that you'd recommend and maybe that you teach through Dojo?
Yeah, so Dojo is actually a platform that we launched symbolically on MLK Day of this year. And it is a platform where you log in every day and you do a quest. And a quest is a question. It's a introspective question. That is essentially one of the many questions that I mentioned earlier. So questions like, write about a time where you felt expansive and write about a time where you felt defensive. What were the differences between those two feelings? Write about a time you saw another human being as a symbol, rather for good or for bad, instead of as a human being. What did that feel like? Write about a time where you felt superior to another individual. What did that feel like? Write about a time where you could actually connect an unmet need to a judgment that you had of another person. So a simple example of this is one time I judged my friend for being flaky, and the unmet need, like I told him he was being flaky, and the unmet need behind this judgment that I had was I have a need of consistency and connection, deep connection. And deep connection just requires consistency over time. And my friend wasn't meeting that need. He wasn't showing up to meet that need. So instead of dropping immediately into blame or judgment, right? And Brene Brown describes, or she says this social science research, in social science research, blame is described as discharging pain, right? So instead of simply discharging the pain that I felt by blaming my friend, I articulated the unmet need behind the blame, and that actually enabled him and equipped him to come back in a way that was where he was willing to fulfill that need. So these are some of the quests that are in Dojo, and these quests are spaced and repetitive, very similar to Duolingo. If you're familiar with that app, if you learn a language on Duolingo, you'll get lesson 1 of unit 1 on day 1, but then you'll get that same lesson on day 4 and day 7, because it's spaced repetitive learning that actually leads to habit formation. So that's what people can expect in Dojo, and it is a subscription-based experience. We just launched it on MLK Day. I'm learning so much about product development, which is a whole nother topic, but that is the name of the app.
Well, you got a free trial, don't you, Sonny? You people can want to use the free trial.
Absolutely, 7-day free trial for anyone interested.
When you said humans, like understanding humans by their symbol, what does that kind of mean? And what would your symbol be?
Oh, this is such a good question, and I'm trying to see an easy way I can answer it. Okay, very, very simply, and I may get in trouble for this, but let's have fun, shall we? Israelis and Palestinians see each other as symbols. They don't see each other as human beings. This is because of traumas that have been inflicted on both peoples, by both peoples, and various other peoples. But just for the purposes of this conversation, Israelis perceive Palestinians as monsters. Palestinians perceive Israelis as monsters. There are many people in the world who perceive Israelis as angels and who perceive Palestinians as monsters. There are many people who perceive Palestinians as angels and Israelis as monsters. these are all symbols, right? Symbols for good or symbols for evil. These are all political abstractions. The first principle of the theory of enchantment is treat people like human beings, not political abstraction. And to treat someone like a human being is to recognize that all of us, being humans, contain both the shadow and the light. We are capable of doing good. We're capable of doing evil. We do good and we do evil simultaneously. Often you can find good and evil in the same human being, in the same community, and so on and so forth. It's a very easy, on-topic example of what I mean by people treating people like symbols.
Isn't it like, Joel, the denial of death, didn't it kind of talk about how humans are half animal and half symbol?
But what he meant by that was like we are able to abstract ourselves into the future, right? And have ideas of like, we have a future self and we have a self-concept that like we can conceptualize in our minds, right? And that's what he meant by the symbolic self, and that's how we create ideas of God and stuff. But I think the psychological perspective of what you just said there is so true and apt, is that like we kind of paint over reality because it's so complicated, right? Like imagine if day to day you walked around and you met people, and as soon as you saw a stranger, right, your brain was fed with a whole sort of computer code of everything about them and their life story and why they've come to the beliefs they have and why they look like the way they do and why they act like the way they do and why they speak the way they do, and all of that information, you would explode. You would not know how to handle that. You'd be completely overwhelmed. So it seems like it's kind of a defense mechanism from that sheer complexity to categorize people into these symbols. And I think the example you've used is very apt, and I think we all do it day to day, whether it's the way we categorize the cliques of friendship groups in our like high school classes, or the way we think about certain generations of people in our family, or whatever, like where someone comes from or what hobbies they do. Like we all do that, and I think it's very interesting to recognize that we do that. And actually all the people that you just view as simple symbols of a certain idea are actually whole humans themselves, and that also a lot of the time the people we can see as adversarial and evil and negative in our lives, they may be that way, but a lot of times we have painted that on them because we disagree with something they've done, and we forget that, hold on, they might just believe and act the way they do because of how they've been brought up or how they've been influenced and all those kind of things. So I think this is really important for people to understand, just to navigate the world,
Yeah, absolutely. There's a practice in Vipassana meditation where I think this comes from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where you are encouraged to think of a single person and see them first as a friend, and then see them as a stranger, and then see them as an enemy, the same person. And the purpose of this practice is to actually internalize the fact that the nature of reality is constantly change. There was a moment in time where you could think of a friend right now, I'm sure in your head, where you didn't know that person, right? At that moment in time, that person was a stranger. There's a moment in time where you could think of that person where they got on your nerves or whatever, where you were annoyed by them. At that time, that person was an enemy. And there's another time where you could think of that person where you felt joy in their presence, and at that time, that person was a friend. So the same person contains multitudes. And so this practice, if done on a regular basis, will actually equip you to be able to perceive that in the other, but also perceive that in yourself. And this goes back to your earlier question about what it means to be integrated, what it means to be whole, what it means to be balanced. It's not a static fixed thing. It's a dynamic thing. To be able to perceive the constantly changing nature of all things is part of, mindfulness practice, and part of the practices of enlightenment insofar as the Eastern traditions are concerned.
It seems like a solution could be like to love everyone, including your enemy, and then love yourself. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is the third principle of the theory of enchantment. Root everything you do in love and compassion. I would also say that the ability to love your enemy really stems from the ability to love yourself, which is actually incredibly difficult. it is easier to discharge those things that you don't like about yourself onto others as a defensive mechanism, right? Which we talked about earlier. It's actually very, very hard to allow those things that you don't like about yourself to rise, bring conscious attention to them, curiosity. Oh, where did this come from? How was I conditioned to feel this way when I saw this person, or think this way when I saw that person, right? That act of paying a kind of attention to yourself is a quality or characteristic of love. It is only by doing that and directing that towards yourself that you can then start to direct that to others.
Yeah, and that seems to be what happens, right? Because they say like bullying, like bullies bully because of their own insecurity, and maybe they see someone else and it comes from like a period of jealousy. So I think this is really practical. Like all the hate, a lot of it is jealousy, and it's that self work that they maybe haven't done. And would you say you are your enemy?
Would I say I am my enemy? You mean poetically, metaphorically?
I
mean,
yeah, you listed
go ahead.
you listed kind of like loving everyone, and I don't know. I kind of think you are your enemy, but yeah.
What do you mean by that, Jacob? Expand on that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
You're kind of restricted by your meat vehicle, right? And you always want to be greater than you are. But you're stuck in this body, and then you've got all these like hates that just arise from you. Not being greater than you are.
So you can be an enemy to yourself at times if you don't recognize it. You don't see that. Yeah. This is really interesting. I think loving your enemy has to come from understanding them, because I don't think you can really love something you don't understand, right? And I think once you understand an enemy, in inverted commas, and by that I just mean anyone who you think has done you wrong, right, in your life, through understanding them, you actually see the person that's behind that rather than the symbol. Do you know what I mean? And when you can see the person, you're like, oh, they're just a human being. Like a rule that I have for myself that I try and bring back is that I tell myself that if I had that person's brain and their upbringing and their influences and their thoughts and their feelings, I would do the exact same thing. And then you just relax at the end of the day because you realize, oh, they're just another human being. They're not like this evil boss from this video game that I'm playing that's called life. They're just another person that's navigating this weird experience as well, and they don't know what they're doing. Like I don't think many people ever consciously act badly. I think people just do what they think is right, but sometimes what they think is right is just hurtful to you, right? So I don't think anyone is consciously evil in that way. And evil's a strong word anyway.
We've mentioned like Carl Jung's shadow a couple of times. Is it just like the shadow has overcome them?
Oh,
yeah. That's interesting. Theory of Enchantment's work is heavily influenced by Carl Jung, and not just Carl Jung. A lot of his female colleagues, like Marion Woodman, wrote incredible books about this sort of stuff. I think I remember Carl Jung saying that the shadow is not just a part of you that you might be ashamed of or feel insecure about in a negative sense. It's also the part of you that you haven't taken full responsibility for. So, for example, my shadow might be triggered by seeing another person be assertive, and it's not because I think being assertive is bad. It's actually because I want to be assertive and I haven't taken full responsibility for that desire within myself. And so to see it in someone else is triggering. So that's an example of how the shadow is like, Carl Jung said the shadow is like 90% gold, right? So if we were to actually get in touch with it and really do work with it and, composting with it, we would be surprised as to the skill sets and the qualities of how our lives would be enhanced as a result of that. I also think, Joel, you said that people aren't usually consciously evil or, acting in evil ways. I don't think people are usually consciously acting at all, like period, like good or bad. I think that most people are not consciously like in the present moment. Oftentimes, if I know that I experienced something, like let's say I experienced my father raising my voice at me as a child, if I hear another man raising his voice, I might not actually be in the present moment when speaking to him. From that moment on, I might be whisked away to a memory in childhood and now seeing this man through the lens of how I experienced my father. And that's a very, I think, simple example, but it's a very profound one, right? Because if every time I encounter a man raising his voice or someone raising their voice, I am brought back to childhood memory, then parental baggage is actually deeply impacting my life, you know, a huge percentage of the time, and I'm completely unconscious of it. I'm completely unaware of it. I don't know why I'm triggered in the way I am. So I think there's a great opportunity before us in trying to encourage more and more of us to do this work. But it's also like, it's not daunting, but I'm just going to use the word somewhat daunting, because I don't think most people are consciously present in the first place, whether for good or whether for evil.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we all exist in these, you would use the word at the beginning of the conversation, like conditioned. And we all live within these patterns, or like the poet William Blake called them mind-forged manacles, like this prison that we create in our own mind of these narratives we've been used to living within. I think you're right. People aren't conscious. And I notice it as well. It's like when something traumatic, in inverted commas, or like an intense emotion takes over, it's right. You're not driving the car anymore, of what you feel and what you think and what you say, how you act. It's not really you. It's like the person I am now having this conversation, I feel like a conscious agent over my own behavior. But I don't think that's the same if someone says something that conflicts with what I believe, and then I get into some sort of conflicting altercation, and I then sort of like I lash out or something, or whatever it is, right? I'm taken away from this person that, like, when I feel like my ideal self, when I'm present, and I'm like, I'm the agent of my own behavior. So yeah, I think you're right. And I think that stepping into consciousness is that scary sort of revelation of self-awareness we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't be a slave to your emotions and your desires, I guess. Become more individual. Make the unconscious conscious.
Yeah, but do you think people can seek this out themselves, or do you think it actually is a consequence of stuff that happens to them outside of their control? Because for myself personally, like, it's not like I looked into this stuff. Like it manifests to me just in my life. The circumstances that seemingly I didn't control all came together at the same time. My mind was changing, my beliefs were changing, and my environment changed. And then suddenly I seemed to be thrust onto a completely different life path and had completely different philosophies for life. But like, do you think that's how it is for most people that you've worked with, or for yourself? Like, these things come along seemingly to us, like we don't choose them.
There is this quote in Harry Potter, which I'm not gonna get right. I'm just gonna paraphrase, but I think it's in one of the first or second films, where maybe it's in the Sorcerer's Stone or the Philosopher's Stone, where Harry Potter is sitting on a hospital bed and Dumbledore tells him that, you know, he asked why did he receive the Philosopher's Stone, and Dumbledore says, because you didn't want it, or something like that. I don't know if you remember the reference I'm making, but I think it's something like that. I don't think one is born trying to, you know, become the Buddha, but I do think there are circumstances that just happen to show up in a person's life that, you know, encourages them or inspires them to seek out a path of integration. I do think, however, that the more people where this sort of happens to, or just so happens to happen to, the more likely it is that we will be able to build ecosystems where more and more people feel safe enough to actually go pursue something like this. And I think that will be the next frontier of like integrated living. is we'll start to understand how it's very, very difficult to do this kind of work as an individual. It's so much easier to do it in communities. Like Thich Nhat Hanh, famous Buddhist monk, said the next Buddha will be a Sangha. The Sangha's word means community. So the next Buddha will be a community of Buddhas, essentially, as opposed to just one single individual Buddha. And I think that more and more people are trying to do like systems design and thinking about like how can we create an integrated ecosystem, not just how can I become integrated as an individual. And in fact, the recognition that like the extent to which I will be able to be integrated as an individual will be limited if I'm not in community with other people who are seeking it out.
How do you think that widespread ability to allow people to sort of accept their own, I don't know, patterns that they've been conditioned to and become aware of them and do this self-work, how do you think that's going to happen? Because in my head, like, I look at the vast majority of people that I interact with day to day, and having a conversation like this with them, they would just, I think it might be wrong, it might just be my opinion and my experiences, but they kind of shut off from it. They see it as like spiritual woo-woo self-work that's just a load of bollocks, that just like, how is that going to pay the bills? How is that going to put food on the table? And I, you know, if you go back to me 5 years ago, I'd be the same. So how do we think we can, I don't know, maybe, what's the word? Articulate and express this idea of wholeness and integrating the parts of yourselves to the general public, the ones that would turn their nose up usually at this kind of stuff? I know it's a tough question, but I'm just interested to see what you think.
Well, I wouldn't have this type of conversation with them, like especially if we're talking about people who are in your community. Is that what you're describing?
Well, I think, didn't you say that, you know, you think this is going to happen more, like the future that we're going in is building more communities of people that are becoming more whole, right? Like, how are we going to expand those communities on a larger scale? Or is the focus going to be on people who are just open to it already? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the people who are open to it already are like your early adopters, and then those people will just start showing up in their own communities, not like trying to pitch them the idea, but just showing up with very different energy, right? Showing up more whole, showing up more willing to be vulnerable, more like willing to vulnerably stand in their own truth, which has its own superpower to that, like to be able to witness someone essentially being like, this is who I am, flaws and all, right? There's actually a power in that that's super compelling. And I think that the more people show up in that way, the more other people will aspire to show up in that way. Because quite frankly, there's a lot of energy. There's a lot more energy in my experience that I have when I'm not constantly trying to, you know, prove that I'm worthy of something, but like showing up where I know that I am loved. When I show up with that energy, it's a very different energy, and it gives me a greater sense of internal resources that makes me feel expansive as opposed to defensive, makes me more trusting and therefore more trustworthy. And I do believe that other people, when many other people see that, they will want to become that. They will aspire to become that. In the same way they're like, I saw other people showing up in that way and I wanted to become that. And I wanted to aspire to that. And I still aspire to that. I'm by no means, you know, where I want to be ultimately. I still get defensive. I still feel triggered. I still feel anxiety around questions of self-worth and insecurity. But I'm open and honest about that. And I think that in addition to not wanting to be insecure, a lot of people crave the ability to simply be honest about feeling insecurity, right? Like that thing alone, I think, is something compelling that will attract a lot of people the world over.
Yeah, I think there's demand. It's just they don't know they demand it. Like, and it seems like this is a great solution for people. Yeah, they just need to be educated, maybe with kind of role models and a reason why to start the journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very difficult. I mean, this is like the paradox. Carl Jung said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. So we're talking about like how to have better mechanisms to deal with your pain holistically. But at the same time, if you are entering into conscious relationship with your pain, that's painful. It's just painful to shift from an unconscious relationship to a conscious relationship. And so that just has to be, I could tell you this, you could read about it, you could hear about it through other people, but it's not going to be anything like actually experiencing it. But again, I ask myself the question, how can I build like products like Theory of Enchantment that makes it more likely that we can build a community, we can build an ecosystem, as opposed to just giving it to individuals? Because I think one of the illusions that we have believed in the West for a very long time is that we have this, solely individual experience. I didn't give myself my name. My name was given to me by people who came before me, right? There's so much a part of my mere existence that did not come from me, right? We live in an ecosystem. And so whether it's mentors, whether it's people that you admire online or offline or both, we have to also understand that the work is done locally, right? It's not merely online. It's not even, I would argue, extremely online. I recently started to take a break from social media because, well, of many reasons, but one of the reasons was like, I think there's this illusion of deep connection on social media that people, sometimes myself included, have gotten stuck in, and it's just not true. Like, this has been an amazing conversation, but I can promise you that if we were in person, it would be even more amazing, right? So like, there's something that simply cannot be mimicked online, that can only be accomplished or felt in person. And so I think we also need to emphasize the importance of doing this work locally, like showing up in this way with your friends and family. It's actually in many ways harder to show up in this way with people who are closer to you, right, than with people who are strangers on the internet. But if you can develop that way of being with your local community and encourage to show up in the same way, you make it more likely that people will start to want to take that journey, because it is, and I know I keep saying this, but one of the barriers that stops us from wanting to go through these ego disillusion experiences is the terrifying feeling that we're alone. And so it's going to be if you think it's hard to scale ecosystems, it's going to be very hard to scale if we continue with the mentality that we can only do this work alone and we're only doing it individually. So whether it's mentors online, or taking what you've learned from online, from books, from things of that nature, and bringing it into your local community, or really both, I think those are some tools and methods that'll hopefully get more people at least thinking about these ideas.
Yeah. I think the pain point also is quite an important one to expand on and touch upon, because I think you're definitely right that to bring about any growth or transformation in ourselves, there is going to be a necessary dose of pain, because kind of like your old self is dying in a way. It's being killed off. It's like a phoenix, right? It goes up in flames, but then a new you arises from the ashes of that. But do you agree that I have this idea that we pick our poison, essentially? Because you can either suffer the pain of these patterns and this nervous system conditioning that you've been living within and you've had no idea of, right? You either suffer that pain, the pain of unconsciousness, or you get the choice of the pain of consciousness, which is breaking free of that, like breaking out of that shackles and in a way making yourself go up in flames, right? So it's not just like pain is down the path we want to take in life. Like, there is pain down both paths, but one pain you take on voluntarily and that makes your life better, in my opinion, and makes you more psychologically and spiritually free. And the other path is painful in itself, but it's more like a slow pain that you might not realize is hitting you until you sort of get to a point of your life where like you're like, damn, I've never really been that happy, And I think that's something important for people to know, is like, if something is hard, it's usually worth doing, right? If it's hard and you do it voluntarily, that can be something physical, like exercise. It can be something psychological, like having a difficult conversation with a friend, or something spiritual, like questioning whether you actually want the things you think you want, right? But if you don't do that hard thing voluntarily, you're going to be given a dose of hard things involuntarily by life. You're going to follow a path you don't want. You're not going to be in good health. You're not going to have strong, meaningful relationships. So yes, it's painful, but it's sort of a dose of pain that you take on, and that has an overall positive outcome. Like, that gratification is delayed, but it's there. It's real.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like the dichotomy that you portrayed there. I was reminded of two sources when you were saying that. One being The Matrix, where everyone is sort of sleeping through life. That, which is a certain kind of pain that I would say it's like the pain of ignorance. You don't really realize that that's what's happening. You're just sleeping through life. So I had that image when you were describing what you were describing. And another thing I thought of was the way that you described the consciously taking on the pain is actually how Jordan Peterson describes the true meaning of Christianity. And he's described this in many lectures that he's done on the Bible, but he said that, like, that's actually the true sort of, like, spiritual message of Jesus bearing the cross. It's like voluntarily subjecting yourself to the pain of becoming conscious, which actually results in a transformation of your very being, which is metaphorically or symbolically represented by the resurrection. So I think that there are a lot of these stories, grand mythologies, and I use that word in a very sacred sense, not to mean false, but I mean it's sacred stories. There are a lot of sacred stories in the psyche or the consciousness of the human spirit that have these recurring themes, which is one of the reasons why Theory of Enchantment has so much pop culture in it. So we're like trying to really get people to consciously engage with their pop culture as opposed to unconsciously merely seeing them as sources of entertainment. There are a lot of these themes, in so many different, cartoons or movies that people just watch for entertainment purposes. I would say this theme is The Lion King in many ways, for example. So, but anyway, I agree with a great deal of what you just said.
Wasn't it like Jung's theory of when like different characters represent different things? What's that called, Joel?
Or the archetypes of the unconscious.
Yeah, that's it.
And how Jesus is a symbol, really, and he represents many of the deep sort of archetypal ideas that we have. Like, it's sort of just, I'm just going to expand the point that you just made, but I really like it, and I've talked about it in the past. So how, like, Jesus is a hero, right? And it doesn't matter whether he's actually walked on water or arose from the dead, right? What's important is what he represents, which is that voluntary acceptance of the suffering of life. And through that, he was given eternal life, right? Or he relieved humanity of original sin, right? He basically took away the evil that humanity was struck with, right? And that's what the message of the Bible is. But in a way, you're so right. Like the Lion King, for example, has a lot of similarities to the story of Jesus, right? Simba thinks he killed his dad, right? That's one of the worst sins you can commit, right? I mean, we know he didn't. We know Scar like set him up or whatever. But what he does then is he goes away from the homeland. He gets banished, right? And then the way he turns it around is he voluntarily accepts what happened, and he goes back and he takes back Pride Rock. Do you know what I mean? And you watch that as a 6-year-old kid, and that all makes sense to you, right? For some reason, this complex narrative of like cartoon lions talking to each other in English, like, but for some reason you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because it's like, it does seem like we have these. This is why I find Jung so interesting, because I think we do have these fundamental, like, stories of the human experience that we can relate to from so early on in life. And like the hero, I think, is, to me, the most important and prevalent of those. And I see it show up in so many, like you said, in entertainment, movies, TV, books, but also religions as well. So yeah, I think that's a good takeaway for people to get from this, for sure.
Have you read Jung then?
Have I read Jung?
Yeah.
I've read some Jung a long time ago. Not a long time ago. I started reading Jung for like during the pandemic. And I don't. You probably can't see, but I have his red book behind me, actually, in my office. So I had a whole phase of Jung. It was basically like in 2020, I discovered Jordan Peterson's original Maps of Meaning lectures at the University of Toronto, and then I read Maps of Meaning. And then actually specifically his lecture on Pinocchio really like was so profound, and I still think about that particular lecture to this day. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's a scene in Pinocchio where the boys are being carted off to Pleasure Island and they're being turned into donkeys. Do you guys remember this scene?
I actually know what he's...
I think I've heard Peterson talk about this Pleasure Island bit. I don't actually know the bit from the story, but carry on. I'm interested.
So I watched this as a child, but I totally forgot what happened. And then I rewatched it after listening to Peterson's lecture, and it is profound. Basically, this exploitive villain gets the young boys to go to Pleasure Island, and he tells them they could do whatever they want to do. They can drink beer all day. They can destroy property. They can play pool, smoke, whatever. And over time, as the longer they stay on the island, what ends up happening is that they start turning into donkeys. And then this villain takes them and like sells them off into slavery. And it is like such a scary but such a thoughtful way to do a villain. It's probably one of the darker villains in the Disney canon. And I'm not sure why I brought that up, but it's worth watching because I think it illustrates like how if we aren't willing to give ourselves up or surrender to coming to consciousness and being conscious of the pain that we must endure in order to live awakened lives as human beings, what we risk is actually falling asleep, and not just falling asleep, but falling asleep in such a way that we are easily carted off into slavery, which I think is like the ultimate teaching of that. You know, Pinocchio dispenses with his conscience in that scene, like he tries to get away from Jiminy Cricket, the conscience, who represents his conscience. There are all these little interesting symbols within the larger symbol of Pinocchio. But yes, to answer your question, I have read Jung. I've read Man and His Symbols, and I've read so much Jung that I actually don't remember what I what I read. I don't know if you have explored any of some of his female colleagues' work. Again, Marianne Woodman, Helen Luke. So Jung talks a lot about manhood, and Helen Luke and Marianne Woodman talk a lot about womanhood. They speak a lot about womanhood within the context of Jungian archetypes, which I find very, very spiritually nourishing as a woman. So just a side note, but two people who you might find interesting if you want to deepen your knowledge of Jungian thought.
Yeah. I remember in Pinocchio, Peterson talking about there's the story of like, I think it's Joan and the Whale, where Pinocchio goes to free his dad or something. I think that's got biblical links.
Yeah.
And what was Maps? Was Peterson's first book, Maps of Meaning, right?
I believe that was his first book.
Yeah. Well, was that a good one? I've only read his 12 Rules for Life.
So I've only read Maps of Meaning. I haven't read 12 Rules for Life. Yeah, I mean, Maps of Meaning was super Joseph Campbell-esque. Super like the hero's journey-esque. I read it, like I said, in 2020 during COVID. I remember it being very good. Obviously, he writes the way he speaks. So if you're not familiar with Peterson's style of speaking, then you might find his writing annoying. However, I had watched the lectures first, and then I read the book, so I knew what I was getting myself into. But I found it very good. I found it very compelling. There's this really beautiful quote where he says, your job is to see your fellow human as a burden, or no, a divine being heavily burdened might yet see the light, something like that. And that's one of the more sacred, poetic descriptions of human beings that I've read from anyone, including Peterson. So I remember being struck by that. But I actually, yeah, I have maps of meaning behind me here as well, near the red book.
Yeah, I think one thing that sort of smacked me in the face when I realized it is we can take a lot of the hidden messages from a lot of the stories in pop culture and actually apply them to our own lives. Like when you were telling that bit about the Pleasure Island and the villain turning the young boy into donkeys, like my brain immediately linked it to like arguably conspiratorial notions, but like the idea that our society promotes through materialism, individualism, all of that, to follow your desires, follow your pleasures. Do you know what I mean? Like eat the McDonald's, buy the shoes, like all of that, right? Like watch the pornography and all the kind of ways that we are led to fulfill the lowest parts of ourselves freely, and that's seen as a freedom of like that's an amazing thing, and I want that, and you know we should fulfill that. That's the narrative we're given a lot of the time, but maybe it does turn us into donkeys. Maybe it does make us mentally and physically weak, and then maybe we are just slaves to the system because we are just sources of economic growth for these companies that just continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And you can argue that's conspiratorial, but maybe it's a good way of looking at life, that there are these traps, because it might seem like the right thing to just follow what you want, but maybe you do just become a donkey and get sold off by the system, you know? Maybe avoiding Pleasure Island is the better way to go. So that's an example of how you can take a story that is read to children, right, and actually see that it outlines something fundamental about how our society works and how we should try and navigate just being a person in the world.
Seems like bravely.
Yeah, that same kind of 100%. Yeah, the same kind of narrative.
Yeah, actually, I would like for you to describe Brave New World to me, because it's one of the few books that I missed in my my high school curricula. Had Brave New World as the book to read in 9th grade, but I missed that one. What's the premise?
So I'll go first, and Jill, you can add on, because I think you might be able to pitch in. But I've only listened to the audio book. Basically, they there's like this, maybe it's like a community, and they take children, and as soon as they're born, they just give them pleasure and pleasure and pleasure, and it's basically like maybe like this island sort of thing where there's all these people that are just driven on pleasure, and then so they're all basically having sex with each other. There's a drug called soma, which is basically just something that people take, and it automatically makes them happy again. And I'll say something that stood out to me that I found out about the book that was quite cool is like there's a couple lines that are like there were toddlers that get electric shocked when they go near flowers, or when they go near books, and then what that does is that child then grows up to associate nature with pain and learning with pain, the arts kind of, and so they just have this just very fixed view on this is life is pleasure, and I can't really remember the ending, but yeah. So anything you'd want to add, Joel?
I think that was quite good. I think generally the overall thing is, right, have you read George Orwell's 1984? So that's like about control through surveillance, right, and totalitarian threat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Huxley's dystopian idea is that actually people are being controlled through their own pleasures. So it's kind of more like a silent killer than the Big Brother idea that we're watching you all the time, and if you step out of line, you know, you're going to get what was the word they used for it? They didn't just kill people, they just completely removed their existence from his history, right? Is it vaporized? That was the word for it, I think. Whereas Huxley's idea is, well, we're going to tell you what you want, and you're going to want it, and that it's like your choice is taken away by even your own desires, right? It's like killing you with kindness. in the most brutal way possible. So like you're being forced to fulfill your pleasures, and with that you are not free. You know, which I think actually, if you're gonna paint one of Orwell's or Huxley's narratives onto parts of the world that we live in, it's closer to that than anything Big Brother, surveillance, death, control, violence, you know, that kind of stuff. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It's we're probably maybe 80-20 Brave New World to 1984. Think about like we kind of have Soma like with addictive foods. You can interpret technology as that, and then we're taught that like nature is not promoted. People perceive education as boring. Yeah, like people are, you just kind of like, you kind of look around and people are very controlled by their pleasures. And with 1984, I think the amount of data that's like shared and monetized of us, I think there could be like a switching point where it becomes more apparent. But I think we are controlled in some way by people that are above us. I think I found something I thought that was quite mad the other day, which is like iPhones now, like the facial camera, it now records your face as you like go through stuff. So for example, if you're on social media, you see something you see something that makes you laugh, it records that. It records your face, that it knows that piece of content just made you laugh. It now knows way more stuff to promote. And so everyone just knows, these companies just know more and more about us. Is it a danger? I mean, we need algorithms to promote stuff that's relevant, but there's definitely a power dynamic that's forever increasing.
Yeah. My friend Tobias wrote a book called Outrage Machine about the social media algorithms. It just came out last year. I highly recommend reading it. It's very good. He used to work in tech, so he understands sort of like the the man behind the curtain, so to speak. But it was also very good because it gave me a comprehensive understanding of how the systems themselves work. And my impression was that there's no one being super intentionally trying to control the masses of people when it comes to social media. Social media started out as something that platforms genuinely people were trying to create to bring people together. And then certain features became invented, like the endless scroll feature on Facebook and Instagram, which mimics a casino in the same way where you're gambling. You're constantly shifting the levers. It mimics that on purpose. Also the retweet and shares button, where there's no friction between you and you sharing an idea. There's nothing that you pay for in terms of making something go viral, right? There's no process by which you have to sit and think before sharing something or before posting something. These are all like, if I had known better, I would have not assumed that these features would have produced all of the maladies that they have produced. But hindsight is 2020. I will say one of the things to be cautious against is the ways in which the experience of persecution can lend itself to an adoption of resentment. So this is a way in which what I would call in the United States, the oppressor-oppressed binary is sort of like a paradigm that affects and infects a lot of the ways in which we speak about trying to promote social justice. The oppressor-oppressed paradigm simply says that there are people in the world who are good and there are people in the world who are bad. You probably have noticed that this is a split worldview, right? This is similar to the splitting that I described earlier, where you see the world in black and white, right? There's the world of the oppressor and there's the world of the oppressed, and all you have to do is be on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor, whether the oppressed is the white man, whether the oppressed is big pharma, or excuse me, whether the oppressor is big pharma, it doesn't matter. You can mix and match and insert whoever you want in that category. The problem with this is, first of all, it's extremely reductive. Human life is far more complex than this paradigm would have us believe. A person can be both oppressed and oppressor at the same time. An institution can be both oppressed and oppressor at the same time. It is impossible to escape, right? I would say that believing in that paradigm is in and of itself a form of oppression because it's an inescapable paradigm. It makes you paranoid. It makes you incapable of living in the present moment because there's only the oppressed and there's only the oppressor, and you always have to be on the lookout for the oppressor so that you will be saved, right? There's a lot of the echoes of puritanical Christianity and in the early history of the United States that are present in that worldview. One of the ways in which the most successful protest movement in United States history, namely the Civil Rights Movement, actually those leaders guarded themselves against that was by refusing to see their enemy as innately evil, which is to say they actually practice loving the enemy. Now, a lot of people don't know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, Coretta Scott King, all of these, great founders and thinkers of the Civil Rights Movement, and King in particular, actually studied both Protestant Christianity and Eastern metaphysical traditions. So the Civil Rights Movement was actually a combination of Western and Eastern theological thought, right? Dr. King studied Gandhi extensively, who came from this Jainist Buddhist tradition of unconditional love, loving your enemy. King also got that from the Christian tradition, right, of agape love, unconditional love, loving your enemy. And he brought those two together in this movement that said, we're going to protest what our neighbor is doing to us, but our neighbor is still our neighbor. Our neighbor is still made in the divine image of God, and we still love our neighbor. So we do both. And that is what it also means to be integrated fundamentally, right? To be able to do both, to be able to notice that what your enemy is doing is not only negatively affecting you, it's also negatively affecting that person. And again, this goes back to James Baldwin's observation that we cling to our hatred as a way to deal with pain. One actually believes if they were to see a person who was addicted to opioids, for example, and let's say that person was negatively impacting their family because of their addiction, we would have the wherewithal to also be able to recognize that that person was also suffering, right? That person is inflicting suffering on the family, and that person is also suffering simultaneously because there's an addiction here. We have yet to come to the realization as a species that this is precisely what is happening with hatred and other forms of persecution. So even as we relish these ideas, talk about how to go from a disintegrated society to more integrated society, recognize patterns of behavior that are unhealthy, that other people may be acting out or, promoting even, it is important that we recognize the critical nature of loving those people, even while we call them out, even while we necessarily point out the unhealthy behaviors that they are engaged in and or promoting. So that's my word of caution that I just wanted to add right there.
Yeah, no, I like that. I feel like the overall message of the conversation, what I'm taking it through it anyway, is like we all, as individuals and as communities, have to aim ourselves to be whole despite the sort of fractured nature of our world, despite the divisiveness between social groups and the way that things try to fracture our minds and our beliefs. We should always try to zoom out and see that bigger picture and come at it through compassion and understanding. So I think that's a nice message that I'm taking away from today.
Or take some mushrooms. That's a good start.
Yeah, that'll do the trick, man.
I got one last question, which basically what was your approach to reading Jung? Because he's very complex, but it's my understanding. But it's definitely worth doing. There's a lot of wisdom there, and I think Jill's probably interested in reading young, and maybe I am as well if I get smart enough one day.
Well, I wish I remembered. I mean, I was reading so many things in 2020, including young. My general approach to reading is to underline those quotes that I really love and that compel me, and then I will often write what I think about those quotes in the margins of my books. And then I will rewrite those notes. I will retype up those notes so I can easily reference them. And I don't like commit them to memory, but like some of them get filed away in the deeper recesses of my unconscious. And some of them become more easily like referenceable or referable. But that's generally how I approach reading any author. I also am I like to read authors simultaneous to other authors. So right now I'm reading a book called Dopamine Nation, which is about how like we're the United States addicted to different sources of dopamine as a way to cope with pain. Some of the things that you guys mentioned earlier, like social media and stuff, are part of that. I'm reading another book called The Witches, which is about the Salem witch trials of 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. So yeah, like I like to read books in conversation. I like to read authors in conversation with other authors. So maybe consider doing that if you're going to veer into young, because I find that authors sometimes speak to each other. At least that's how my brain interprets them. So yeah, that's a suggestion.
Yeah, it gives you a little break as well in between, like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and unless you've got anything else, Joe, I'm happy to finish that.
Yeah, that was really nice. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you both so much for having me. Is it okay if I send you all links to Theory of Enchantment that you can promote?
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, like, so if people want to discover more about your work, what steps should they take? Where should they find you?
You can find me on theoryoфenchantment.com. Theory of Enchantment is the name of my company, my organization that does a lot of these practices. You can also follow Theory of Enchantment at, twitter.com/Theory of Enchantment or Instagram.com/Theory of Enchantment. I'm less and less on social media these days, so I post articles sometimes in different publications, but I am in an active practice of trying to wean myself off of the dopamine drip that is social media. But if you're compelled by anything I've said and you want to get in touch, you can also email info@theoryofenchantment.com, and myself or a member of my team will be in touch.
Well, thank you, Chloe. This was great.
Thank you so much. Take care.
See you later.
Yep.